So before I introduce our speaker, we're going to say a word here about a Prairie Festival institution that continues this year, and that is to have a Strom Donnelly Lecture on conservation and restoration. I never had the fortune to meet Strom Donnelly. I know from a rich oral history here of the pivotal role that he played in the intellectual life of the Land Institute, including on the board of directors here until his untimely death in 2008. He also leaves a written history. One of his signature concepts that has been meaningful to me is the concept of orchestral causation, the idea that the symphony can start with a movement of the conductor's baton. There can be a movement of a bow over a viola, puff of air into a clarinet. Each has its own sound. The sound that emerges is a bigger and richer thing than any of the individual things that caused it. That's the way that I know Strom Donnelly is through his writing. I'm going to turn to Bill Vitek, our good friend Bill Vitek, who's been up here already, to say a word or two more about Strom.
Good morning. Hi, thanks. Oh, don't do that. Strom Donnelly was a philosopher, a philanthropist, a fly fisherman, an outdoorsman, an athlete. He was funny, he was tall and handsome. And I think Fred asked me to come up and talk about Strom because he thought I shared at least one of those characteristics. And I think you can guess which one. I'd like to begin with two images of Strom Donnelly, whose memory and legacy we celebrate this morning with this lecture. The first describes his agility and pure physical energy. A group of us were called to Matfield Green, Kansas in June 2004 by Wes to talk about ignorance. It was called Toward an Ignorance-Based Worldview, and Wes had a big sign up at the old school in Matfield Green that said, "Welcome, ignoramuses." And we had a t-shirt made. Can you stand up and show us that we were going to take it on tour, but we had a t-shirt made for it too. So we all met in this fifth grade classroom and sat on these little chairs and talked about philosophy. So after a long day of talking in this fifth grade classroom of the old school, someone found a bat, a softball, and one glove. So we headed out to the field. We agreed that no one would use the only glove. Each of us gravitated to a position on the field that best reflected his or her athletic abilities or lack thereof. Though one of the oldest players on the field, Strom went to third base, a position that only later I learned he had played at Hotchkiss in prep school, and that he was a two-sport athlete at Yale. I went to first base only because someone had beaten me to right field. So I apologize to you right fielders out there, but you know what I mean. But remember, we didn't have any gloves. So the second batter hit a line drive to Strom's left. It was too hot to catch, and he wisely batted it to the ground. He eyed the runner's speed, calculated the time he had to make the throw, and then in a single motion scooped up the ball and fired a white rocket across the infield. I watched all this and stood with my hands outstretched, awaiting the impact, and I thought, are you kidding me? I caught the ball, we made the out, but a searing pain registered in my hands. This game went 7 innings, and Strom became more energized as the game went on. He was fearless and in constant motion. It was Donnelly to Vitek, and we recorded many outs that day. He was no worse for the wear, but I had an aching welt in my right hand. That lasted a month. That's true. The second image reflects Strom's philosophical side. He always insisted that the great cosmologists and metaphysical thinkers of the Western philosophical tradition be at the table with modern-day economists and scientists and policymakers, and that our discussions about saving wetlands and building community in Chicago, for example, required these grand speculators and system builders to be at the center of the conversation. He called his references to Heraclitus and Parmenides and Spinoza and Whitehead philosophical riffs. A musical metaphor he understood well, and Fred just mentioned another musical metaphor about orchestral causation. He understood this musical metaphor well. Riffs are not just catchy notes. Riffs are musical memes, powerful ideas, true expressions of form. You know what I mean. The first notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, John Coltrane's explosion of notes at the beginning of Giant Steps, and so many others. Strachan never tired of reminding us that these philosophical riffs and roots were necessary to support the policy, scientific, and legal alternatives we sought. That, of course, was music to my philosophical ears, and because of Strachan, I completely changed my philosophical focus away from ethics and toward metaphysics. I dug in and started reading Spinoza and Whitehead, and I thought, are you kidding me? Now it's my head that hurts, not my hand. Strachan was a deep-thinking philosopher in restless motion, and it seems like a contradiction to talk about a philosopher in motion. But Strachan's legacy is a beautiful and powerful example to all of us who want to engage this difficult and necessary work. Thought and action must go together. Strachan was a complex and beautiful patriot for all good things wild and free. He was too briefly our mentor and tutor. Those of us who know him miss him, but he continues to be in this place, and I can hear his voice still in the annual talks in his name.
Thank you for that. And so now I'll turn to introduce the Strom Donnelly Lecturer, Severine von Tscharner Fleming. Severine and I go back almost 24 hours now, but we have things in common. We are both members of an elite group of graduates of the undergraduate short course in Natural Systems Agriculture at the Land Institute. We also have in common that our last names, our German last names, are almost Gothic in appearance to anybody who tries to spell or pronounce them. And so we have a kinship, Severine and I. Severine's the executive director of the Greenhorns. I was using some of their publications in my previous job before I came here. Co-founder of that organization, of Farm Hack, of the Agrarian Trust, connections to the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and a farmer to boot. So Severine is going to give us our thoughts here on new customary rights, Greenhorns, Buckaroos, family farms, and the future tense. Severine.
Got my propaganda out front. Is that okay? Hi, everyone. Hi. I want you to know I left 2 polydactyl kittens at home to come here. That the big paws, you know, when they have extra paws. And out front of the view that I now enjoy, living the dream on a saltwater farm in down east Maine, the pastures have turned purple with asters and dancing, fluttering moths. And the underbrush is all red and sumacy. And I've been studying from that position, I've been studying the intertidal every day because where I live has tides that are sometimes 26 feet up and down, and especially if it's sloped, then it's even more. And so flying here over the air, looking down, I studied the topography of this Kansan landscape and all the riparian waterways that are all the bushes and trees. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's seaweed. Anyway, just you see what you're looking for, I guess. I am so thankful to be here and surrounded by such warmth and candor and Kansan hospitality, and to get to spend a bit of time more with this riddly sphinx who runs this joint. And yesterday, I laid in the shade, listening to Wes talk, and just feeling like a marble swirling around in the cosmos of history and future and possibility and emergence. And I found my mind made more nimble yet ever than it could. I don't know how are we gonna keep feeling that feeling. So thank you all, and thank you, Wes, and thank you for all this plant breeder energy of people looking at the genetics, nuzzling up into the genetics, and reacting to the plant kingdom and queendom so practically and openly, and how much attentiveness was in the field yesterday. I mean, farm tours are fun, but when it's blasting hot and windy, you sometimes expect the attention to stray a little, but it didn't. So that attunedness is really impressive to watch. So my talk today has a certain theme to it, but it might swirl a little. And the fundamental question is, what does the land want? Or specifically, what does the land want us to do? And so I come to you as someone with 10 years of data studying the young farmers movement, its aspirations, its characteristics, its kind of archetypes. The young people who are from city or from country backgrounds deciding to charge back to the land to make a livelihood and a place for themselves in the countryside. And looking out on this audience, it's interesting. At the barn dance, it felt like it was all these wonderful young dancers, and kind of like the cabin boys of the mariner scene. And now looking out here, there's some ancient mariners. There's some seasoned, able-bodied seamen who are still in the shop once a week with all their big collection of tools. And then there's some of us who are still trying to find, all the different size knives and screwdrivers and table saws that we will need. And it really is apparent to me from the data that I'm working with of the young farmers and their life stories, how necessary all those generations are in coherence with one another, in consonance together. So what does the land want from all of us based on where we are in our own life story on the land? So some of the things that I have watched from these young farmers is what was talked about yesterday, the listening. Let me go a little back to where I am for a second, just to orient. Where I am now on the land, the beautiful buildings were built by men and kept by women who made a living hunting whales, and who then some of them built banks, and some of them become traders, and some of them became owners of boats, and they were trading, for instance, barrel staves to the Caribbean to carry molasses back to make rum. And some of them were going in clipper ships all the way around the world to carry back tea. Meanwhile, people back at home were busy in the woods cutting down the trees. And the next generation were out harvesting cod, then sardines, and successively working their way down the ecosystem to now where I look out from my farm and I see blue boats of guys harvesting seaweed to be turned into fracking powder for the extraction of oil from the earth. And so I'm aware, living in this kind of scar tissue ecology of coastal Maine, whose biggest beautiful trees were used to birth this merchant economy in the age of sail, and who were proud revolutionaries. You know, in the first naval battles of the Revolutionary War took place down east. And realizing that we are, in our architecture, in our identities, in the roles that we play, as she was saying, you know, we really are the daughters of extraction, or the granddaughters, or the great-granddaughters of extraction. Whether we have an identity in this current generation as country people or city people. And facing that, and acknowledging it, and feeling okay with it. It is. And so what I see when I see the opportunities that people are finding on the land, young people getting into agriculture, is kind of a similar opportunism to how those sea captains and sea captains' wives were navigating up these rivers, situating these tide mills, situating these smelters and these lumber mills, figuring out where was trade going to be with the Canadians when Thomas Jefferson shut down international trade so they could smuggle off behind the rocks in the fog. And that kind of strategery and opportunism is just as possible now. And that although we may be in the social media generation and finally tuned to the hum of each other's opinions in the click-o-net, and able to use the click-o-net to get the Amazon delivering anything we want in a rural area, we are, I think those who have made it in this game of new agrarianism have been the people who are able to, you know, move that gesture from the Facebook into a handshake, into a partnership, you know, move that onto a hip and lean back and think and consider and have some foresight and intuition. And, you know, even since we're here and we're getting a little bit prophetic about the world that is changing so fast around us, and where do we want to situate ourselves in that world? So that has meant for many people borrowing, and stealing their way onto land. It's meant apprenticing themselves to elders they believe in, and humbling themselves through the hard labor of weeding in the sun and hauling heavy things around, up, down, and over, and washing them, and then putting them away, and then taking them out again, and bearing the comments of people wearing very expensive shoes when they make note of the price that you're charging for your potatoes or your carrots. And the ways and the tactics that people are using to navigate then through this, you know, pretty impenetrable thicket of a life trajectory, a professional trajectory in agriculture, is possible to start from any place, but relies on a few key factors. And so, especially to those of you in the room who haven't yet plunged your life into too many failures and are still rosy-cheeked and eager to do good and are here, I felt like it would be worthwhile underlining a few of those for you. Is that okay? So if you happen to be in the city, for instance, one thing I'll tell you is a lot of people who started in the city have friends who know about graphic design, have friends who worked in the restaurant business, have friends, let's just say it, they have friends because you're in proximity with your body to other people. And although heartbreak is something you will, feel in agriculture, and heartbreak of not having any land is something you will feel in the city, you can share that heartbreak with other people, and you will need those people once you're out on the land being heartbroken by dead livestock or by floods or storms or whatever it is. And so start now thinking strategically about the people that you trust, and knowing the whole parts of your friends and colluding with them, and conspiring with them and co-visioning with them how the work that you're each doing contributes to each other. Because so many of the farms that we've watched start from a backyard to, from a hobby backyard to a small farm on a few acres on a handshake deal to a 100-acre farm providing food for thousands of people, happen through not the success of one man or woman, but through the collusion of a community of people and the contributions of a community of people. And we see that again and again in the life stories of these successful young farmers. This would be the moment where I should tell you that we have been bundling and broadcasting and distributing and elbowing young farmers, what's it called, in the ribs, to get them to tell these stories of their struggles and their aspirations in many different forms. So if you wanted to tune into some of that data, you can listen to 8 years of podcasts, and you can read the anthology of 50 essays and the 100 contributors in this year's almanac, and the one before that, and the one before that. And you can also access it by talking to any older person. If you ask them how they got started, they will tell you. And they'll like telling you. And so, if it's uncomfortable and shy to talk to strangers, that is a pretty good bet as an intro that it might go well for you. So starting in the city, starting where you are, figuring out what you can do, figuring out, of course, also your other careers, your other skills, your other aptitudes and economically viable winter activities, and getting trained up in those practices and having a friggin' resume together such that you at one point or another could get a loan from either a bank or a micro-lending organization. On the talk yesterday, there was a question of, where is the money going to come from to support these young farmers? And that's a very important question. The practical thing I wanted to interject at that time, and I have a chance to interject now, is that we have FSA loans, microloans for beginning farmers, and we had them quicker because the guys from Silicon Valley who felt a small amount of guilt making their fortunes in PayPal set up a thing called Kiva, which does 0% interest loans up to $25,000 based on your credibility within your community and 2 paragraphs of text. We have a 100% repayment rate from the young farmers, so they love us, they being Kiva, because we also keep all of the donors who are donating to these revolving loans, just keep the money flowing into Kiva. So Kiva's like, man, this agricultural community is amazing. So if you know somebody who is at the beginning of a business plan, I just want to make sure you spread the word about these 0% interest loans, and also know that because we had such good data and because it was happening on the internet, the FSA had to change their tune and start issuing these loans to young people who presented with business plans that didn't include corn, beef, soy, and who were talking about growing for CSA and talking about growing for other markets. So okay, so here we are. We're talking about the life way of the new agrarians, their path onto the land. We're talking about the collusion within their own community. We're talking about cooperation and intergenerational talking. Those young people who are making it out onto the land, often it starts in a little corner. Like, I'm thinking about my friends in Idaho who they started with sheep and they started with CSA in basically the little wet corners where none of the big equipment could fit, and who did a good enough job with that little corner and that forgotten barn that wasn't being used to deserve the attention of the next door neighbor, who also had a little back orchard, homestead orchard, and a little back acreage that was too small for the big machines, and who are now grazing their sheep in the margins of, kind of similar to how the trees are, in the bottomlands of this, monoculture of the Palouse, which is another wheat growing region in Washington and Idaho. And so that the ecological restoration work and the grazing of these areas through intensely managed stewardship is actually happening kind of on the fault lines of the dominant land use pattern. And if you're thinking in those terms and you're squinting and you're saying, well, I want to heal the land, the project is land repair, I want to re-diversify, I want to grow for a local and regional market, I want diversity, I want hedges, I want sentience, I want cud on this landscape, it's that kind of strategery to wiggle your way in that you're going to need. And one thing that is noticeable is once they wiggle enough, all of a sudden, people show up and say, there's an abandoned cranberry bog down there. I see that you're good with the blueberry jam. Maybe you need to know about that. And in a time of kind of data overload and information overload and all this clicking and clacking and, that sharing of that kind of land information, the possibility that the land holds. What does this land want? This land wants sentience. This land wants ambition. This land wants engagement. And when it is seen that those young people are bringing that chutzpah or, insanity, and you trust them enough to tell them what they need to know to do more and better. That's the kind of economic solidarity that doesn't happen with dollars at all. So I just wanted to include that right up front with the 0% interest loans and the cash, because I know for a fact that the number of tool sheds that are in this barn right now could resettle thousands of acres of land. And the collections of, the hoarders of metal and kind of mechanically inclined of you have a lot to teach those of us who didn't have the mechanic shop and who are struggling to figure out potato digging on slightly of a short notice. So the coming together, and I think we've spent a lot of time organizing parties for young farmers to meet each other and convene and feel their own momentum and show their strong bodies to one another, because actually the young women are starting to outnumber the young men, and so it's getting competitive. And what we've noticed in that is that the weaving project of each of these farms can hold more than just that farm together. And so that once there was one farm, for instance, I'm thinking now of Essex Farm, really wonderful horse-powered farm in upstate New York, attract ambitious people as interns. They work so hard, they become high on their own chemistry. They fall in love. They go spit it out right down the road, and they start their own farm. I mean, it's a slightly more complicated story than that, but there's a successional dynamic that is ignited when this new kindling touches these old embers of the land and the place and what it has been and wants to be. And those flames start licking out in every direction. And those flames then can hold, as I say, more than just that farm. So once there's one CSA membership and there's one person's college friends and high school roommates and professional lineage from the West Coast and the guy they knew who went to Alaska to fish, all of a sudden they're selling frozen fish and they're selling someone else's cheese and they're selling someone else's eggs. And yes, Whole Foods was stolen by Amazon. Let me promise you this, in the next 10 years you will see a lot of women and men of my age starting new grocery stores because we know that we need it, and we're willing to do the logistics. And so many of the most successful farm regions that we watch, in this project of new agrarianism are already running their own food hubs. Some of the most successful farms are already distributing 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 other producers' products on a weekly basis. They've got the technology, they've got the sheds, they've got the wherewithal. So anyway, I don't want to go too far on that, but if you're that type who thinks, oh, I want to be involved in agriculture so badly, but I don't know because I have a bad back, there's room for you, and we will really appreciate you in that project. So we talked about the tactical geography, we talked about economic solidarity, we talked about, lending someone an electric heater or part of your shed, helping them out of a ditch. We talked about place awareness and the history, knowing the history of the place that you lived, what is likely to be the secret cache of gutter material or roofing that you can find in abandoned old barns, and what are likely to be the pieces of equipment hanging around. What does the land want? So the 19th century homestead where I am now living my dream didn't give the land exactly what it wanted. And although there was a lot of good common sense that was applied in that paradigm, we have improvements to make on how these arrangements are made. And a lot of the identity that is inherent with this white homesteader, hipster meets lumber hat meets logger, what are these things called? Slapping, yes. It's not enough. That's not enough of an identity for the project that we have, and it's not enough people, and it's too exclusive, and it's unfair, and it's inaccessible, and it won't work. So although it's funny sometimes to dress up like that and be in a nostalgic kind of a way, it's obvious to all of us, I would say from the world I live in, that we've got to have more people on our team than just ourselves and our wife, or our, American Gothic doesn't account for the fact that, the woofers also need their dishes done. And that really also runs up against one of the problems that we have in terms of the affordability of farmland, which is that it is not affordable to buy farmland on a farming income or even with a supplemental income in this country at this time. And so more and more of these new farmers are having to figure out different arrangements that are dynamic, that are experimental, that are in some cases disequilibrious, to beg, borrow, and steal their way onto this farmland. And if you go onto our Agrarian Trust website, you can read a whole catalog of case studies that we've been doing to look at how these people are doing this work. But what is clear, and we have convened now multiple meetings and national symposia to discuss at length the land question in the United States, is that way more out-of-the-box thinking and way more collaborative and cooperative and conspiratorial economic relations will need to flourish and expand if we're going to get the people back where they belong doing what the land wants. And that we will require a heck of a lot more participation from city eaters and suburban eaters, institutions, supply chain players, and farm families who own land, making decisions that are what the land wants than we currently have. We're going to need a lot more weird wiggling and thoughtful squinting and kind of around the corner prophesizing to eventuate in those young people having access, durable access to land. And you'll notice I'm not saying ownership. And that's because ownership implies a right to cut down all those trees like they did in the 19th century. And ownership implies a commodification of an ecology to sustain a nation that's building itself through export, or that's shipping everything off to be made into fracking liquid or to be made into coal, or whatever it is, whatever it was that's being shipped. And I think in the understanding that's emerging of places that have seen their regional food system develop, there's an understanding that we all have some right to that land, not just the owner. It's all of our land. It's all of our upland. It's all of our watershed. It's all of our wildlife. It is our common heritage and common protection against hurricanes. It is our common plight, that landscape. And our common resolve is needed in order to hold it for our own benefit. And so all these conversations, it's all very nice and abstract, groovy talk. But practically, I think what it's meaning is certain rights will go away from the way that we farm land in the future. For instance, the right to degrade and destroy and export. So that if a community comes together to hold the land, this doesn't have to be all the land, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but in the different ways that we experiment, that when those communities come together to hold the land for their own food sovereignty, for their own self-determination, for their own region and food security, then the kind of farming that will happen there will be the kind of farming that we're talking about here. It will be restorative farming. It will be diverse farming. It will be multi-enterprise farming. It will be farms that also are baking the bread, farms that also are running the summer camps, farms that are doing mother calf and doing milk and doing hay and doing greenhouses full of winter greens. And each of those different enterprises are being run by different people, not just man and wife all alone. Because that's the intensity of management that the land wants. And that's the intensity of care and discernment that these kinds of farm businesses require. So that's going to mean getting along differently and relating comfortably in a way that's quite intimate. And I think we all have a lot of those skills already from the barn dance scene. And touching each other's hands and waists comfortably and with consent and in respect. But I feel it's important to recognize that as we renegotiate what our service of the land will be in this highly changing climate and developing a whole new language and culture of the weather and its fluctuations, that we're also renegotiating how we are operating with one another across privilege, across class, across gender battle lines, and that discomfort is also exciting because it shows us that we're wiggling out from something that's already making us uncomfortable. And yeah, hips, I think, are a big part of this. The hips. Keeping a little bit of a wide stance. Okay, so I grew up as a city kid, and both my parents are urban planners, and I got to go out and fall in love with the countryside because my great-grandfather polluted a river and made money in textiles. And so I got to experience a farm life and a farm summer and a farm love that was basically paid for by poisoning a river. And my mother, for the last 15 years has been running a river conservancy in my hometown, and she always says, and she doesn't actually talk about that very explicitly, but she says, you know, if you want to change something, you're going to need to smile, and you're going to need to grit your teeth, and you're going to take 30 years, and you'll do it. And frankly, her methodology is very effective. So I guess I would just say that I'd love to talk more in detail about, you know, how this agrarian trust is structured and a lot of the different ways in which different communities are negotiating, you know, church lands and institutional lands and, you know, beer companies adopting farmers to, you know, take all their brewery waste and turn it into compost and start farms, and, you know, school districts and land trusts who are planting orchards that are community orchards for, you know, genetic base of experimental or historic orchard crops, et cetera, like all this interesting experimentation that's going on. But I think that's the point, is a lot of it is going to be experimentation, and there's the volition that is felt in the hearts of the young people who are wanting to farm matches the volition of those of us. It's a distributed kind of a volition. And it's a volition that has to be like dancing up against each other's, and dancing with and observing from and learning from and being transparent about, well, that didn't work. And we figured out why, but we're not mad at them. We're just observing that was part of their volition, because that's how life is. Life is dancing around, you know, my kittens with the weird paws. I mean, that trait is so common in Maine. I don't know why. Each of us is holding our genetic truth in our bodies, and our genetic truth informed by our history and the place histories we've been a part of. And I think that this exciting time of rediscovering new frameworks, new kinds of relation, new associations, new associative forms, whether it be in hurricane response or in pipeline defense or in spontaneous solidarity of the female gender expressed through millions of marchers in the streets, that we're blobbing well in this crisis. And we just got to keep on blobbing with our hips. I think I'm going to leave it there. I know there's no questions. I'm going to call on young people first, and then we'll flip back and forth. Green. She asked a question, which is, how do we get the word out further to recruit more young people who aren't already tuned into the new agrarian revolution and make it really accessible? Well, this is like as an executive director of a small nonprofit, I get the chance to talk about my programs, right? So we actually have been lucky enough to partner with a nice organization called Guayaki, which is actually a company that makes tea, who has funded us to do a new series of programs, expanding from the anthologies and the almanacs and the radio and the documentary and our 3,000 film screenings and our partnership with co-ops across the country, trying to get mass media attention for the young farmer movement, which we have successfully done for a long time, and from page of USA Today and New York Times and NPR and BBC and all over the big mainstream media, and then often people's grandmothers cut it out and mail it to their kid who seems to be oriented in that direction. But now we've started doing these like short films for more of like a Vice audience to explain and interpret specific strategic life ways that help to intervene in our dysfunctional food system. So we start with a dysfunctional feature, i.e. monoculture, or i.e. drought, or i.e. concentration of power, or i.e. I can't get access to land. And we start with the dilemma statement, and then we track the life story and attitudinal observation or attitudinal approach of people who are kind of cracking at that problem. And so they're called ourland.tv, and you can watch them on the internet for free. But I think it would be really great for other partners to come along who are in the food supply, in the what did she say yesterday? In the supply chain, other supply chain partners, acting as protagonists and transmitters of this information about how to apply your life directly, other than as a consumer of these products. And so I'd like to just say really openly, like, if you have ideas, let's talk. Because, although many of the best organic farms have waiting lists of 300 applicants for their jobs, for their apprenticeship jobs, and although the organic conferences are now having 20, 30, 40% increases in the youth attendance at their conferences and are offering scholarships, we still are missing a lot of black and brown faces. We still have many more recruits to do in especially farm communities of kids who otherwise are just going to go to FFA and see the big equipment and see that it's not really resonating. The narratives there are not really resonating with what they see on their home farm. And we just have been attending a couple of FFA conferences in the past couple of years. And actually, the last one was called, it was called Hunger Games. And because that's like a Hollywood movie, but it's a Hollywood movie about a trilogy of speculative fiction novels written by a woman about a totalitarian food state where the different ethnic groups fight each other and the central control of ridiculous people fight those different producer groups off of each other to maintain control. But then the revolutionaries join forces between the different producer groups and overcome the empire. We all know about the Hunger Games, right? Okay, so here you have, Monsanto and Tyson and DuPont and Cargill and all these big guys with their big tractors saying the motto of the FFA, this is 60,000 kids. Thank you, Organic Valley, for letting us go. Saying volunteer to be a tribute, i.e. offer yourself as a victim in the Hunger Games. And so I think there's a level of discord between this propagandistic fake news of big ag to these kids is freaking those kids out, and they're opting out. Our former Secretary of Agriculture, Vilsack, would note frequently that only 16% of the U.S. population is rural, but 41% of the armed services are rural. And that the recruitment of farm boys into the military is a lot to do with the fact that farming, the conventional system, I don't need to repeat this, but like the recruitment rates are low, and we're losing these kids, and those kids have land. And so let's work with these kids, all the different kids, the kids of different backgrounds are, let's marry them and cross them up, let's hybridize. But if you have other answers that you would rather hear, I'd love to hear them, and we should talk about it after. And that goes for everyone.
You mentioned land trusts, and at least the local land trusts are very much about local control. So I'm willing to bet that many of us here today have local land trusts in our community. So my question is, what have you been doing with land trusts and the Land Trust Alliance, the national organization that might be a
Yeah, well, and the land trusts are getting to get a little bit wider hips too. There's been some strong structural critique of land trusts preserving beautiful vistas surrounding beautiful homes of people who grow hay for horses that they occasionally ride. And that critique is widely shared by many of the young farmers some of whom then grace the front catalogs, but the minority of the acreage of those same land trusts. So I stand here as a little frisky puppy. And so our land trust is actually the Agrarian Land Trust, of which I am a co-founder, and happily hiring 2 full-time positions for 3 full years of employment in our beautiful startup, is really offering a little bit of an embodied critique of some of those limits, but also recognizing that, they did a lot of good pretty fast. And they represent a consciousness of community interest and community ownership and the community project of conservation and restoration. And so there's really cool things I could point you to, which is something called OPAV, or what are like the super easements or affordability easements that are being put on now, which essentially says, if we use tax dollars or local fundraising dollars to preserve this farmland, remove the development rights off it, then the people who are farming it have to be growing food. Sounds obvious, but it's not. And then, furthermore, that farmland will remain affordable into the next and the next and the next owner, such that it doesn't become just gentrified into a non-food producing landscape. So yes, it's good that it's not built upon, but let's also keep pushing the envelope such that it becomes actually good habitat for new growers. Because if it is so close to, if we have the data that shows us that preserved farmland is disproportionately less likely to hold beginning farmers and is disproportionately closer to white wealthy people, that's like, that's like a petting zoo place. Those are places where you can sell crooked carrots, because you have the great story and you're out there cheekily working and stuff. Like, those are exactly the places that need to be incubating new farmers. Those are like the gentle places for the brook trout to have their spawns. And then we send them out to the wilds and the woolies and the cheaper land and the hard desert and the, backcountry where the land is cheaper. But let's incubate them gently in those kinds of places. Well, it's funny because I've just been haggling with the internet provider in my town because we want to put like free high-speed internet in the old Oddfellows Hall. And, a lot of towns have this amazing infrastructure, built from the beautiful lumber that forged the identity of this age of extraction. And they're empty and they're falling apart, and, the key is held by an 85-year-old. And, and it's $125 a month to get high-speed internet in there. And so basically my scheme for that I can tell you about, and there's different schemes different people do, and I have a whole little resource of things from the farm hack world of distributed network solutions that are like in Catalonia and in rural Italy. But my solution is that we're going to have a blueberry winnower, a chicken plucker, an apple cider press, butcher tables for processing chickens, and wood splitter, and basically a bunch of shared homesteady tools so that people will pay a membership so that then they can come to the hall and use all those infrastructures, use it for yoga, use it for buying club, use it for movie nights and popcorn, use it for storing of stuff, but then, and of course for the books of Greenhorns, which is why we got it in the first place, but basically try to make that a shared expense, because it is, like, especially when you're down a peninsula or up a mountain or whatever, like, the internet just doesn't go there. And we're all so addicted to Instagram. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that that's what you have here, too. I'm going to need a little more money to spend time to dance that dance right now. We don't have capacity. Like, we were able to go a couple times, and we gave away a lot of flyers and website stuff, and we were able to distribute what we already make. But I think that to do that really well would take a fun project of, like, real relationship building and listening, and, you know, this thing called community organizing. And yeah, I would really welcome that opportunity. But if you have ideas, like, I think a lot of times it manifests as those kids who are suspicious, then they go and prepare themselves to do something else, like electrical engineering or computer stuff, or, you know, they figure out a different angle for their lives. And what we see a lot in terms of the, you know, who's selling at farmers market and who's at ag conferences and then who gives talks and who saves seeds and who sells tools or whatever, is people who went off on that other angle and developed their professional skills and networks and capital and credibility and like built their family, and then were able to come back and not have an intergenerational conflict on the farm, and then come back and say, you know, we're going to convert this dairy to selling milk for all the baristas in New York, or we're going to not do liquid milk, we're going to do yogurt, or we're going to, you know, also now do goats and serve an ethnic market for goats, or however it is that those family farm businesses are able to morph. It usually requires the morphee, or the second gen people to, like, build up their strength and character and determination and their kind of their own data set of what's possible, to be able to come and you know, interface gently with the demographic dynamic of their family or father's instincts and institution. And that, you know, that's just part of the dynamic of change. And how do we support those people better in that? And, like, also especially being able to talk frankly about conflict. Like, I think the holistic management framework is so powerful as a way of openly sharing differences of opinion and saying, well, my goal is, and then they say, well, my goal is, and instead of, like, do it my way, no, do it my way. And, you know, we need to learn that stuff, and I think that we can learn that stuff. But so much of where the dysfunction you see, you know, what is it, the 5 Ds of farm death is, like, debt, divorce, departure, depression, and death. And nowhere on that list is compromise, negotiation, and everybody gets their own space. So, but anyway, I'm just being glib, because it's actually a major problem. Yeah.
Seems like one of the traits that you embody so well that is central to the story you tell is charm. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about how can younger people strengthen themselves in more than just charm? Charm lessons. Seems like that's
Well, oh, she said, oh, you're so charming. And then she said, it seems like charm is a very good tactic for young farmers. And I agree. And charm is also like marketing your product, especially when your product is a little bit lumpy in the beginning. And kind of like my talk. But I don't know, like that thing about the blueberry, not the blueberry, well, actually it was blueberries, the cranberry bogs. Even just this over and over and over story about, you know, people who came, maybe they had nose rings, maybe they didn't have nose rings, but they were not from there. And they found a homestead and they were busting their butts and, you know, cutting hedges and planting trees and laying drip lines and putting in pumps and, you know, moving rapidly around on the land. And then just like magic timing, somebody rolls up and delivers them the piece of equipment or tells them that important piece of information. And it's not even charm. It's like the charisma of virtue. And, you know, a good show, putting on a good show. And that also aggregates this certain kind of power that that you see, like that basically a part of almost all these farm stories was this magical moment where it was basically on the line, and you know, stuff fell into place. And you know, I'm sure that happened to Yvonne Chenard at some point too. But that definitely is an ingredient I see across the board in these stories. It's like when everything was on the line, you know, it had to work. Oh, I'm being cut off.
It pains me to do it. Severine von Tscharner Fleming.
Thank you. Thank you.